Suspected acts of sabotage, mapping in preparation for attacks, and the possibility of espionage. Critical undersea infrastructure is increasingly discussed in strategic and military terms. With 99% of the world's digital communication relying on subsea cables, the infrastructure is becoming part of the arsenal for grey zone tactics. So, how vulnerable are they? And in turn, what damage can be inflicted by targeting the growing network under our oceans? I'm Katja Bego, and this is Connected on Taiwan Plus. And to update us on what's happening on the European seabed, we're joined by Katja Bego from the International Security Program at London's Chatham House. And joining us from Abu Dhabi, we have Brendon J, Associated Research Fellow with the Institute for Security Development Policy, for a primer on submarine cables across the Asia Pacific. Thank you both for being part of the program. I'm going to start with you, Katja. There have been a number of incidents around Europe's waters, but deliberate sabotage has been hard to prove. So why is this now being considered a part of grey zone warfare or tactics?
Yeah, hi Divya, good question. So it's an interesting situation. So we've basically had since roughly 2023 a number of back-to-back incidents where a number of undersea cables and other quite important infrastructure on the seabed in the Baltic was damaged. But in each case, it was a commercial ship using an anchor, which is not per se that atypical to happen when it comes to sort of damage to infrastructure. It happens occasionally. It's just more the pattern of it. With this happening in quite quick succession 3 times in a row. And then also happening in quite a geopolitical, I would say, hotspot, of course, in the Baltic Sea, very near to Russia. Some of these ships having either links to China or Russia, which made it all a bit murky. So it's basically the circumstances around it, I would say, that have really led a lot of countries in the region in particular to quite quickly point to potential sabotage or kind of grey zone incidents.
Now, Brendon, cable security was discussed recently at the Shangri-La Dialogue among a lot of ASEAN countries and further. Why do you think now it's become a focus of discussions? And what are the main concerns that are being regarded in this part of the region?
Well, thanks for having me, Divya. It's a good question. Yeah, cables have been around a long time. And so why all of a sudden all of this interest in them? Remember the Quad grouping, Australia, the United States, Japan, and India in 2023 promulgated a cable connectivity and security agreement, or at least a document that stated we need to secure cables. And so why 2023? Why not 1993, et cetera? Well, the answer really doesn't have to do so much with sabotage and a long list of those, as Katja mentioned. But a lot of this had to do with the Nord Stream pipeline gas explosion, the gas pipeline explosion in the Baltic Sea. That really got the world focused on undersea infrastructure. And so I think a lot of it has to do with that. We've also had these accidental cuts. The Baltic Sea was mentioned. Those appear to be actually sabotage. But an accidental cut was the cable that was cut in the Red Sea when the Houthi did hit the MV Ruby Mar with a missile. But as the ship was listing, its anchor dragged and it cut a cable. Initially, the reports were that the Houthi were now cutting undersea cables. The Houthi made it very clear in public statements that this wasn't the case. It was an accident, even though they did mean to sink the ship. And so, therefore, we're in this situation now where lots of people are focusing on cables. But the bigger picture behind all of this is polarity in the international system, great power rivalry, China-U.S. And so that's really what's driving this, is what are rivalrous sides going to do vis-a-vis these very important undersea infrastructure that allow us to communicate with one another on a daily basis.
There are so many points there that I want to unpick as we go through our conversation. But before we do that, I want to ask you, Katja, basically, how vulnerable are these cables? Whether it's deliberate or accidental, can a cut cable black out an area or region in Europe and shut down their internet?
We maybe see quite a bit of I would say, alarmist reporting sometimes, that cutting the cables could black out the global internet. I think that's not really the case. And similarly, these cables are actually not that vulnerable as a network as a whole. So individual cables, they're quite thin. They're not much thicker than a garden hose. And they're usually buried when they're nearer to the shore, but not always. So they can be reached. But the strength of the overall network is really in sort of redundancy in the networks that tend to be. So if you look at, say, a place like the Baltic, there's a lot of cables. So even if 2 or 3 or 4 are cut, it tends to be possible to kind of divert traffic to other alternative cables, which means that in practice, you don't even really notice it as an internet user. And some of these incidents did take place. The incident Brendon mentioned in the Red Sea, which is quite a notorious choke point, I would say, for global connectivity, had much more of an impact already. It didn't throttle the internet, but there's a lot of quite key cables, and a lot of global internet traffic goes through the Red Sea, which is quite a big vulnerability, I would say. So there you start to notice it more. I think where the biggest risk is instead, where we do actually see the sort of fragility of the network, is in places where there's not that many cables, right? So there's some islands that, including the Matsu Islands, which I think have been discussed on the show a couple of times before, that only have 2 cables. So if both of those go down, actually a place is left without the internet. So it's those places, it's kind of so-called thin lines, they call it, that don't have that many cables, that are quite vulnerable. And I think hypothetical scenarios where, for example, in an actual all-out conflict, where you would see a large number of cables destroyed or damaged at the same time, that's where the risk is quite large. But I'd actually say, as a network overall, it's very important that we have more attention to this now, kind of think about the sort of context of vulnerability and protection in a far more contested world, where a lot of these sort of sabotage operations or maybe all-out war are unfortunately more, let's say, on the agenda. But in the meantime, I think for individual cables, the network is quite strong, and we have quite good ways of addressing some of those vulnerabilities too.
As Katja mentioned, it's somewhat of a numbers game. So before we continue, I'd like to put the cable network in perspective in this region. 15 undersea cables connect Taiwan to the global internet. Meanwhile, Vietnam, not an island, and a nation of 100 million people, is largely dependent on only about 5 submarine internet connections. So in early 2023, all of Vietnam's cables broke down, reducing the country's data bandwidth by 75% as it had to route digital traffic over land to China. Brendon, basing it on cable numbers, is Taiwan really that vulnerable?
Yeah, it's a good question. The answer is yes and no, and I'll explain why I'm giving you a double answer there. Taiwan is vulnerable just simply because of geographic proximity to China and China's designs on Taiwan. So that's the yes side of the answer. The no is there is the redundancy. And so what we wouldn't expect cables to necessarily be attacked in isolation. Now, there's the gray zone tactics we've seen in the Baltic and elsewhere, although mostly in the Baltic, that, the Matsu Islands again, that makes sense. Only 2 cable connections, as was already mentioned by Katja. So very close to China. Again, proximity does play a role. But one of the things in the research that I've done with others on this topic is looking at something termed a regional seas approach, which was developed by Christian Buger at the University of Copenhagen. And this idea would be to create regional seas, either look in isolation, say, for example, at the Baltic, or create your own undersea cable regional seas approach. That would look at securing cables from, say, connecting Japan to Taiwan, to Philippines, to Guam, and back to Japan. That would be one way to look at this. So we would expect that cables would be cut in the advent of a conflict with China, but otherwise we're going to see them possibly damaged in isolation, and the saboteur would likely try to make it look like an accident.
Right. So let's have a look at what Europe is doing then. Besides internet cables in Europe, there's also extensive military NATO infrastructure under the sea. Can you tell us what that's for and what that might look like?
Sure. I would say that as a general thing, that the Baltic Sea has become a lot more important for infrastructure on the whole. And this is quite interestingly, in some ways, linked a little bit to some of these tensions with Russia as well. So we have, of course, the data web and a lot of undersea kind of data cables there, many of which do serve a dual purpose in that they'll have commercial traffic going through them, but these are similarly the same cables that would be used for, say, military traffic. And I should mention that's the case for every cable, really. So a lot of normal military traffic or kind of sensitive traffic will go to normal commercial cables. So in the advent of a conflict, this would be like a target. So we have the cables. And there's a lot of energy infrastructure as well on the seabed there. So we see less in the Baltic, but in Europe in general, quite a lot of push, of course, towards new offshore wind farms, these sort of things that need to be connected, could be potential targets. And then a lot of the energy infrastructure, so power lines, gas pipelines, oil pipelines, and the Nord Stream and the Baltic Connector, big examples. What's interesting with those is that a lot of those projects were quite explicitly conceived, for example, for the Baltic countries to basically allow for more energy independence from Russia. So those Baltic countries, well, traditionally been very interconnected with Russia, and for understandable reasons, they're a bit less keen on that, a lot less keen on that now. And it's a massive vulnerability and a potential conflict. So a lot of these pipelines, etc., have been, we'll say, the Baltic Connector, which is the gas pipeline that got damaged in 2023, was explicitly conceived as a project to connect Finland to the Baltic countries for gas exchange, these sort of things. So those are targets. Those would be, if they would be that much harder to damage than data cables as well. So you could see kind of more serious conflict scenario or potential Russian incursion into the Baltic countries, that those would be targeted. It would severely kind of complicate a military response by NATO.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so Brendon, if we bring it back to this region, and you've spoken about the Quad, Australia, India, the US, and Japan, what kind of concerted effort are we seeing from them in protecting cables or looking at cable security? Is there some kind of a roadmap that they have?
Most of this work is being done in isolation from one another. Like a lot of Quad initiatives, it raises the issue at the quadrilateral level, and there's a public announcement about it. And then one of the countries, one of the members, takes the lead on that. For example, Australia has taken the lead on the Quad initiative on cable security. To that end, Australia has attempted to develop what's called a gold standard for cable security. But my understanding is in conversations in Japan and India and the US as well, that this works really well for Australia, perhaps, given its unique geography, but doesn't work so well, for example, in the Bay of Bengal. A lot of this has to do with overlapping EEZs, territorial seas, et cetera. It also has to do with who your neighbors are. One of the things that has come out of the Quad initiative, as each country, it appears, is working on this on its own first and foremost, is that this is probably a good idea for things to be done at the unilateral level first. That's because given the really complex legal and regulatory regimes in different states, and also just knowing who to call when a cable is damaged. I mean, Denmark and the other Scandinavian countries have had to deal with this recently. Understanding who that is and where they are in national capitals is fundamental to cable security. Remember, most of this has been done by private entities up to now. And this raises another question, is how much do we want the public sector involved in cable security? After all, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is not a new technology, and cables have been, frankly, very secure, and there's a lot of redundancy, as Katja said, already built into the system. And so one of the things I've been hearing from industry side is that their life is getting more complicated and more expensive as policymakers and scholars like ourselves get involved in this issue. And so there are those complications as well. On the one hand, perhaps we're getting more security. On the other hand, we're getting a more complex situation.
Katja, are there similar discussions in Europe about this? There have been some critical breaches that we've seen that European leaders have had to react to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a very similar picture in quite many ways as Brendon describes. I think in Europe, there is the advantage that there's both NATO and the European Union as coordinating mechanisms, and are trying to do quite a lot on that level, particularly in the EU, thinking about, for example, how can we bring more redundancy into the network? How can we have clearer point persons, etc.? That's an issue not quite resolved. There's a lot of push as well to get a lot better at, say, sharing data between countries. So if one jurisdiction has quite good insight on what's happening in one place, that we can share that immediately. Say the ship's on its journey. Well, if that's happening under, for example, NATO umbrella as well. So there's that sort of coordination happening. And I think the two other aspects to this are quite important in that regard. It's indeed a bit, as Brendon mentioned as well, to have a kind of shared rule book or shared approach, if you will, because it's, even now as kind of countries are in the process of live responding to some of these incidents and trying to think kind of bigger picture about some of the resilience of these infrastructures. If one country finds this a lot higher priority than another does, or one country is a lot more willing to respond quite forcefully during an incident and others are not, like it's quite important to have a joint response and to understand where red lines are, how you share information quickly, how you can identify kind of the right private sector actors. So if it's my cable that's broken, but perhaps actually the owner of that cable is in another country, that sort of thing, to make that a lot smoother, because that's been one of the challenges that really comes with this being, of course, very international, very interlinked infrastructures that are shared between many countries.
And Katja, countries like China and Russia are doing extensive mapping of the seabed. Why is there so much concern over that, and what can they do with the information?
There's been quite a lot of news in Europe, or incidents in the past few years, where some Russian research vessels, this is a quite famous one called the Yantar, has been spotted in the territorial waters or exclusive economic zones of various European countries, and a bit further afield as well, allegedly mapping the seabed there. So that's with the idea either, well, sort of a dual role perhaps of sort of typical provocations, if you will, to say that we can be present here and it's difficult to stop us as we do this. And then maybe testing the waters as well to see how countries respond to such kind of incursions. So we've seen, for example, in the UK, escorting the ship out with waters a couple of times, and we proactively call out that that's what Russia was doing. So you can call that one bucket, let's say, of the provocation bucket. But there's the second aspect of it, is that it is believed that these ships are basically trying to map the seabed, maybe pre-position, maybe understand what's happening on the seafloor in case of a future incursion where they might want to do something bigger. I can say that that's really what's happening, but that's a line that a lot of governments are taking on this. What's interesting there, as you mentioned previously, some of this military infrastructure, that there is some suggestion that they're also particularly trying to look at that sort of more sensitive cables that are maybe less well known in the public domain, where those might be laid.
So much of this is speculation, isn't it? It's really hard to put your finger on exactly what is going on. So in the spirit of speculation, Brendon, in an actual military conflict, would we actually see ships dragging anchors across cables and pipelines, or would we expect far more advanced methods if cables are going to be used as part of gray zone warfare or conflict?
Well, if we're into a conflict, then of course all bets are off. But as we've mentioned already, there's a lot of redundancy in the system, and also cutting a cable between point A and B is not necessarily straightforward in that it only harms country A or country B. If you cut, for example, a tier 1 provider cable connecting Singapore with Chennai in India, for example, you would likely have latency or severe downtime in terms of internet to 16 or more countries. So there's also a potential boomerang effect. If you're the saboteur state and you cut a cable, you yourself could experience some of the blowback of that. And so, again, it's the more we get to understand this kind of weaponized interdependence, or certainly just interdependence, maybe it can't be weaponized as well as maybe policymakers are thinking right now. And so what is possibly a silver lining here with all the securitization of cables that's occurred over the past couple of years is that adversaries in the international system may realize that this is one infrastructure they don't want to touch unless it's in isolation. Gray zone tactics, putting that in the bucket of provocation, as Katja so aptly mentioned comments. I think we expect to see more of that. The real way to damage cables in large numbers and with kinetic effect would be to attack landing stations. But of course, those are generally or always on national territories, and that's generally akin to a declaration of war. And so that's thus far been avoided, in my understanding.
This has been so interesting, and we are going to continue the conversation. And do you think attacks on undersea infrastructure should be considered acts of war? Let us know in the comments below, and click the video beside me for a look at what military alliances have been doing to address the threat of gray zone tactics. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell if you don't want to miss more stories on tech and business from Taiwan.